Imagine a cold case from colonial times being solved more than 400 years later. That's exactly what happened when the skeletal remains of a boy were found in a hidden grave located in Anne Arundel County.
And one of the things that occurred over time was a change between pipes that didn't have a heel and pipes that had a heel. And you can literally tell by the ratio of these two that you're somewhere around 1670.
In 2002, archaeologists researching Maryland's lost towns from colonial times stumbled across an extremely rare find on this sod farm near Annapolis. Buried underneath a layer of ash, animal bones, and bottle and ceramic fragments lay a human skeleton. This is the actual site where the Levyneck boys' remains were found. Over in the north section of the cellar here was where archaeologists excavated the skeleton. Eric Cullen first discovered the skull and other remains in the 17th century cellar located at a site called Levyneck.
Well, we wanted to know, I guess, first what happened to this person. Was he murdered? Was he someone's loved one? I mean, we figured probably not, since he was thrown in the bottom of a trash pit. But we just really wanted to find out who that person was and try to solve the mystery.
Shortly after the discovery, the archaeologists contacted forensic anthropologist Doug Owsley with the Smithsonian Institution. Through analysis, Owsley determined that the Levyneck boy was of European descent and about 15 to 16 years old at the time of his death.
One of the things, for such a young man, he already has herniated discs, part of his vertebra. They're showing compression, wedging. They're showing compression of the disc space into the body of the vertebra, so he's carrying loads that are really heavier than he's built to do.
Owsley concluded that the young man was most likely an indentured servant, one who suffered from tooth decay, infection, and a poor diet.
An indentured servant, you were required to work like a slave for 6 or 7 years, and the owner knew that when your time was up, you were leaving. So they didn't particularly care about taking care of indentured servants, whereas, believe it or not, a slave was something that you wanted to keep healthy for as long as possible. An indentured servant, you wanted to get as much out of him in the 6 or 7 years as you could before he'd leave.
Indentured servants were quite common for Europeans traveling to the New World, but what was unusual about the Levyneck boy was his burial in a cramped, shallow grave in the corner of a cellar with a trash pile covering it. The milk pan used to dig his grave was resting on his rib cage. It's more than 400 years later. Have you determined that he was murdered?
Well, there's certainly enough evidence of trauma that something happened that got out of hand. I don't think it was necessarily whoever he was probably working for, whoever he was indentured to, necessarily intended to kill him, because that's a tremendous loss of value in terms of the whole process of indentured servitude. But something happened, plus he was a little bit debilitated. He had a sickness going on. And from that, then they went to steps to disguise his death.
And tomorrow we'll take you to the Smithsonian's Written in Bone exhibit, the place where the lost boy's skeletal remains are being displayed. Well, yesterday we told you how forensic anthropologists have solved a 400-year-old cold case from colonial times. The Levyneck boy, as he is known, is now part of an exhibit downtown at the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History.
This fellow is a migrant farm worker.
Forensic anthropologist Doug Owsley analyzes bones and artifacts to crack historical mysteries. In the case of remains found at a site near Annapolis, he determined that the teenage boy was an indentured servant of the mid-17th century.
In the laboratory, we will begin an analysis to determine the person's age and sex, their ancestry. We could tell that he was European ancestry. One of the things that we can do is, from a small amount of bone, we can tell where they come from. And so in this instance, we would test his bone chemistry to determine what he's eating, and could determine that he had a European diet.
At the Smithsonian Museum, Owsley and his team have collected more than 30,000 specimens from around the world, a collection that spans many long corridors. As curator of an exhibit called Written in Bone, Forensic Files of the 17th Century Chesapeake, Owsley knew that the skeletal remains of the Levyneck boy would be a perfect fit.
He is the story of the indentured servant. He's someone that lived his life, brief life, and nobody ever wrote a word about that life that has come down to us today. So it's an opportunity for us to look at those bones and really talk about him as an individual and what happened to him.
In a unique collection of rare bones and artifacts, archaeologists have been able to learn what life was like along the Chesapeake in colonial times.
If you had tobacco, the world would beat a path to your door because everyone wanted tobacco. It was the way to get rich, growing tobacco. So they obviously had all of the stuff you see is imported. So they led a fairly comfortable life. They probably ate well, and compared to life back in England, they were doing fine.
The exhibit gives the public a chance to hear the stories of everyday people, the unsung heroes that you don't read about in history books. At the exhibit, young people get some hands-on learning about ancient bones in the Forensic Anthropology Lab.
We have real human bones in here and objects that are part of forensic cases, and they can try their hand at trying to solve the case as much as they can.
As for the Leatherneck boy, his remains lie in repose, a centerpiece of the exhibit.
I feel sorry for what he went through. It's a rough life back then. But I think if he could come back now and see everything that's happened, the fact that this exhibit has come out of bodies that have been, found throughout Maryland and Virginia, and see the progress that's been made to tell his story and what happened, what life was like. I think that's pretty neat. I like that.
And a very old cold case is now closed, and you can catch the free Written in Bone exhibit through February 2011 at the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History.